Need some people to say, well, human beings and animals can enjoy affectionate relationships that are indeed sexual at times. And you've recently gone into print and said that as long as the animals are not harmed, there's no moral objection to bestiality.
I haven't exactly said that. I mean, the only thing I've written on this is a book review in which I simply described what was in the book, and I said, look, a lot of people seem to have great abhorrence of this. Why is that? Is it because we're just trying to preserve this gulf between humans and animals again, and the idea that some humans might want to have some sexual connection with an animal somehow threatens the gulf that we'd like to dig between ourselves and the animals and, you know, put ourselves up on a pedestal? And what I said is, look, you know, obviously there are some forms of human sexual interaction with animals that are simply cruel and harm the animals in various ways. You can think of others if you want to. I don't know how graphic a description you want, but you can think of others where the animals are free to come and go if they wish, where they're not being harmed in any way, and so...
They consent.
If you like, they consent as much as animals can ever consent to anything, yeah, sure. So is there really a problem here? What is the problem? Okay, it's a bit abhorrent. We see it as unnatural, as deviant and so on. But, you know, that's how people used to think about other forms of sexuality that we now accept. So why is this particular taboo a taboo that has stuck, whereas taboos against masturbation or sexual relations between people of the same sex have not stuck? And I think perhaps the diagnosis here is that it's something to do with this gulf that we like to have between ourselves and animals. And as I said, I don't see much of a basis for that. But, you know, that's not to say that there aren't any objections that anyone might have to it, or that I'm sort of giving it my blessing or anything like that. Just to raise questions about why is it that we still have this deep abhorrence about something that you can hardly even discuss it. Whereas, as I say, with things like sexual relations between people of the same sex, we've definitely moved on, and I think progressively moved on to a more open attitude where we can talk about it and we don't have to regard people as somehow abhorrent or disgusting because they engage in it.
Well, again, I can anticipate someone saying the logic of that might take you to places that you really ought to struggle with philosophically and morally. For example, one might say, just as interspecies sexuality has been frowned on in the past, but there may not be a moral objection to it, intergenerational sexuality has been frowned on in the past and indeed in the present, but there perhaps should be no moral objection to pedophilia or to adults engaging in sexual contact with 10-year-olds who appear to give some recognition and consent.
No, I mean, I think the issue here is whether this harms the 10-year-olds and will harm them in their sexual lives later on.
And there are some pedophile campaign groups who say there is no lasting harm.
Well, obviously you need to have a look at the evidence as to whether that's true.
If there was no lasting harm psychologically, would that pedophilic encounter be justified?
Look, I'm not going to answer that question because I think you have to really consider that question more thoroughly, and I don't think there is any kind of evidence about that, and I don't want to say things that some people will regard as justifying pedophilia when clearly there isn't.
Isn't that the logic of your position, though? As long as the child is not in the long term harmed, you can't rule out the moral permissibility of that behavior.
Well, I mean, I guess the logic of my position is that, as elsewhere, I'm a consequentialist. I'm concerned about preventing harm of various kinds. I don't have kind of intrinsic moral taboos, if that's your point. Yes, I don't have intrinsic moral taboos about that.
So you can't rule it out as a morally legitimate action?
If you think that whether actions are right or wrong depend on their consequences, you can't rule anything out until you know something about the consequences.
It's just wrong, though, isn't it?
No, I don't see that you can say that. That's not my view, right? My view is not that anything is just wrong, full stop. You're trying to put words in my mouth. You may think that, but, you know, I would say, why do you say that? I mean, maybe, you know, you have evolved as a being that has certain deep intuitions. Your intuitions are given by evolution. Certain kinds of sexual relationships do not lead to reproduction. We have evolved to have negative attitudes to those kinds of sexual relations. And that's true about...
In a sense, we're having a disagreement about what seems obvious. Someone would say to you, this is a moral failing on your part if you don't see that it's just wrong.
You haven't let me finish what I was saying, sorry. We have these moral intuitions which we can explain in terms of evolution as to why we have them. And they would include a moral intuition against sexual relations between people of the same sex. And we know that there's a long history of persecution of people who have been homosexual. And we have now, fortunately, started to rethink our intuition, whereas a lot of people would have said, just as you said a moment ago, it's just wrong. Can't you just see that it's wrong? It's a moral failing on your part if you can't see that for two men to have sex is just wrong. Now, I don't think that it is. And as I say, many people have come to see that it isn't. So I just don't think this moral method of saying it's just wrong is a method that we should rely on, neither in this case nor in the others.